My name is Amanda Granning. I'm a meteorologist and the Fire Weather Program Leader at the Duluth National Weather Service office. This is a 7-minute presentation summarizing the changes that were implemented this season to the fire weather planning forecast. First, a little background. This is the Duluth Fire Weather page. Introduced this year is a map which allows you to click on the area you're interested in and it will bring you to the latest planning forecast for that zone. Here's an example. Now this page shows a brief discussion followed by the 7-day forecast. It's important to note that this forecast is intended for planning purposes and is only issued twice a day. The forecast should not be used for tactical decisions. Please request a spot in order to obtain the most up-to-date forecast with specific conditions for your burn location. Alright, let's move on to the changes that have been implemented this year. Previously, the planning forecast has been an average of the values over the entire fire weather zone. However, for portions of our region, this has led to an unrepresentative forecast, and here's why. This is a map of the Duluth National Weather Service area that we provide forecasts for. The fire weather zones generally follow along the county boundaries. Recall that in previous years the planning forecast has been an average of the entire zone. Well, you can see here that some of these zones are exceptionally large, spanning 60, 80, even 100 miles from one end to the other. The consequence of averaging the weather over such a large area is that the details become washed out and the result is a forecast that is unrepresentative. Let's look at an example to illustrate this point. So let's take northern Cook and Lake County zones, located in far northeast Minnesota. Much of the Superior National Forest lies in this zone. The background image here is what the forecaster has created as the expected minimum relative humidity value for today's fire weather forecast. If we look at the value, we see a forecasted minimum relative humidity of 33% near Ely and a value of around 45% closer to Grand Portage. Now, as I mentioned, in previous years the planning forecast for this zone would be the average of all the values within this zone. So if we do this, we get an average of 40%. Then we put a 5% range set on either side of this value for the planning forecast that would read something like today's minimum relative humidity for this zone of 38 to 43%. Now, even though the actual forecast calls for lower values in some areas and higher values in other areas within the same zone, what this means for you is if you're planning a burn, say east of the Ely area, the minimum relative humidity value you read in the morning planning forecast is too high. Now this example uses the minimum relative humidity, but the same thing is happening with all the values of the forecast, including the maximum temperature and the wind. Now I already shown how the large zones in our region play a role in the fire weather planning forecast. We also have to deal with complex terrain as well as the proximity of the cool waters of Lake Superior, which also both greatly influence the weather within these large zones. So this brings us to what we've done this year in an attempt to improve the accuracy of the planning forecast. Starting this year, for some zones, the fire weather planning forecast is no longer the average of the weather across the entire zone, but is now the average of two separate areas within that zone. So this is another map, the fire weather zones in the Duluth area, similar to the ones we've been looking at. The fire weather zones here are outlined in white, and these boundaries have not changed. The fire weather zones themselves are exactly the same. However, now we have these colored areas that represent regions that we have defined as having similar weather conditions, or what we call our local effect areas. For the purpose of the planning forecast, these areas have to have a name or a label. So for example, the green area here within the zone that includes the Superior National Forest, we call this region the above 1,600 feet in the planning forecast, and then the gray area would be referred to as below 1,600 feet. Similarly, if we look at the Bayfield County over in Wisconsin, the yellow area in the planning forecast will be referred to as above 1,200 feet, while the gray area is referred to as below 1,200 feet. So let's look at an example. This is the same map we were just looking at. Again, the white lines are the fire weather zone boundaries. Let's use central St. Louis County as our example. Again, recalling that the old way of producing the planning forecast was to average the entire zone, then provide a 5-degree range around that average. So we would see a maximum temperature today with a 5-degree spread of 36 to 41 degrees. However, now the zone is separated into two different areas. We have a colored area here that we've labeled north of the Laurentian Divide, and then the rest of the area, or the gray area, which we have referred to as south of the Laurentian Divide. Now, the planning forecast finds the average for these two separate areas and results in a forecast that reads today's maximum temperature 39 to 44 north of the divide and 34 to 39 or cooler south of the divide. And you can see that this forecast now provides a more accurate and more detailed forecast. So this is an experimental change, and we know it's not perfect, but we had to start somewhere. These local areas were primarily decided upon based on terrain, but we can make changes to these however we wish based on any feedback that we get. So thank you very much for viewing this presentation. Please send me any questions, comments, or feedback as you work with this new forecast through the season, and have a very safe fire weather season.